Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology. We're very proud to host and to work with the Lux Center for Jewish Catholic Studies here at Sacred Heart. I'm Father Raul Gomez, the President Rector, and again, it's my pleasure to welcome you. This is our annual Lux Spring Lecture. Tomorrow, we'll also have a second part of this lecture with seminarians and students. So today is the public lecture. Now I invite Mr. John Sweeney, one of the co-directors of the Lux Center, to come forward and introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I see we have some segregation over here. I wanted to point out a few folks who are here, because if you have a question about what the Lux Center does, I'd like you to know who you might ask a question of. A few of the members of our governing board, we have a governing board and an advisory board. Members of our governing board, would you quickly stand? Father Mark Maston, Deacon Steve Kramer, Dean Daniels, Rabbi Steve Adams. Yes, sorry. And who are you pointing to? Oh, and yes, and Julie Newberry. Julie Newberry, one of our new professors, members of our governing board. If you're a member of our advisory board, would you just raise your hand? Several of you are here. These are people you should ask a question of if you want to know what the Lux Center does. This is our last public event of this school year. I would hand out our brochure to you, except they are collector's items at this point, and this is the last event on the brochure anyway, so it wouldn't be of much use to you. But I do have two, so if you need one for your scrapbook, get it from me after the talk. We're delighted to have our speaker with us today. Professor Massimo Faggioli is one of our leading authorities on the history and administrative functions of the Roman Catholic Church, with specific expertise in the papacy, Vatican II, the Roman Curia, liturgical reform, New Catholic movements, and on Catholicism and global politics. As you will soon hear in his voice, he is an Italian. He earned his graduate degrees in Bologna and Turin, having studied in Germany for a couple of years along the way. He speaks many languages and offers an interesting perspective on the role of the American Church in the global Catholic Church. Dr. Faggioli writes regularly for many publications, including LaCroix International and Commonweal here in North America, in addition to publications in Italy and elsewhere. He is professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University in Philadelphia. And of course, he's the author of many books, and you'll see copies of those back there on the table. One of the recent ones is the Oxford Handbook of Vatican II, which he co-edited with Catherine Clifford, published by Oxford University Press. Massimo is featured often in national and international media, commenting on theological and religious issues, as well as on the inner workings of the Vatican. He's also, by the way, an expert on gelato. But from what I heard last night, he knows very little about Wisconsin custard. But as it turns out, to grow up in Italy in the 1980s is to watch Happy Days dubbed in Italian. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Massimo Faggioli.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the Lux Center for this invitation. Thank you to the Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology for this invitation. I've discovered much more than just custard in my first visit to Milwaukee, but it's a very, very important moment, I think, and a very important subject for us to consider in these days. This lecture was planned early in 2023, but the events of October the 7th and after October the 7th changed its function, made it, I think, more urgent, and also more delicate, because in the last almost 6 months, it has become clear the unique role of Catholic-Jewish dialogue in this series of events, but also in the larger history of the church and of religion. On October the 7th, I was flying to Rome for a conference at the Gregorian University on Pius XII and the Holocaust, organized by American, Vatican, and Israeli institutions. During that conference and in the exchanges between American, Vatican, and Israeli ambassadors and political leaders in those days, it became clear to me the periodizing nature of these events, and at the same time, the revelatory effects of profound changes in dealing with anti-Semitism and the relations with the Jews in the Catholic Church in the last few years now and in the next future. Coming back to the United States, in these last few weeks, it has been no coincidence that two public intellectuals that have devoted significant attention to Catholicism and to Pope Francis, with two completely different takes, Indian author and public intellectual Pankaj Mishra and New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, have also come to represent, in the last few weeks, two completely different interpretations of the situation in Israel and Gaza and the role of the Church in this. In their two views, Douthat's unapologetically Western view of Israel as part of the West, and the mirror-like Western-centered but anti-colonial view by Pankaj Mishra, look like, strangely enough, like the sequel of what American historian Charles Maier argued in an essay published in 2000. In that essay, Maier argued that at the end of the 20th century, two opposing narratives to explain the century developed. One was centered on the role of the Holocaust, and the other on the post-colonial. The narrative of the Holocaust is paradoxically seen within a story according to which the West advances towards the values of humanism, of the Enlightenment, and progress. In this narrative, the Holocaust is perceived as a catastrophic aberration, a fall in barbarism, a danger that would continue to infest Europe and the West if two reactionary forces were still allowed to proliferate. And this narrative paradoxically justifies a defense of liberal democratic values. On the other hand, the post-colonial narrative, in which the Holocaust has no unique and no universal value, had not affected the Catholic Church internally back in 2000, 25 years ago. Now it has affected that, and we can see this more clearly since October the 7th, I think, but also since the election of Pope Francis. And this is one of the major points of today's lecture. There are, in my opinion, three major issues that underline the importance of the link between the upsurge of anti-Semitism and the contemporary situation of Catholicism, and they concern different aspects of the difficulties in the reception of the theology of the Second Vatican Council in the post-Vatican II church and world of today in the 20th century. The first problem is of looking at the past of the church and of Christianity in the new moral structure of the public conversation about religion and politics, of which Catholicism in part. The second is the issue of the land, of the state of Israel, as paradigmatic of the difficulty of interpreting in the current crisis of the international order, Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council and its silences. Third, there's the transition from a Western European matrix of Catholic theology and magisterium to a global Catholic church that is much more diverse and pluralistic in terms of historical backgrounds compared to the time of Vatican II and to the early stages of its interpretation. First issue, the Catholic Church looking at the past today. Dealing with the most painful chapters of the past in the Catholic Church has always been a very delicate issue. But it has become even more complicated lately, and not just from an institutional point of view. In conservative Catholic circles, there has always been a refusal or reluctance to address the past of the Church in a critical way, in terms that are not apologetical or providential. However, in recent times, it has been visible that the shift from an attitude of apologetics, which was typical of a classically conservative and clerical Catholic culture, to something that is closer to a denial of history, an attitude that owes more to the post-truth than to the old-school theological conservatism. From the point of view of the history of the Catholic tradition, it has always been clear that some theological reforms require a certain discontinuity in the teaching of the Church. Nostra Aetate is one of the conciliar documents that represent a change in the sense of continuity and of reform, carrying important elements of discontinuity, particularly in paragraph 4. And in the history of the post-Vatican II Church, and especially during the pontificate of John Paul II, Nostra Aetate was received and further developed significantly more than most other documents of the Second Vatican Council. But that was John Paul II. In the early 2000s, and with the passage of pontificate to Benedict XVI, something happened. I think it was an escalation in the refusal of a certain Catholic culture to deal with the past as part of the battles for the meaning of the Second Vatican Council. What happened between the first and the second decade of the 21st century was not just a continuation, but a mutation of that Catholic theological culture that was critical of the theological developments that took place at Vatican II. In the last few years, in the shift between the pontificates of Pope Benedict and of Pope Francis, especially in some English-speaking Anglo-American quarters of the Catholic intellectual and political elites, there has been a transition from a neoconservative to a neo-traditionalist movement. And it is a traditionalism that is different not just from the milder neoconservative Catholic movement of the 1990s. It's also different from the first generation of the schismatic marginal movement led in the 1970s by Monsignor Marcel Lefebvre. As it has become evident since 2013, these radical anti-Vatican II movements have left the margins and have become more mainstream, also among members of the clergy and some bishops. The once centrist conservative criticism against some aspects of the reception of the spirit of Vatican II have become more radical. The criticism is no longer against some aspects of the reception or against the appeals to the spirit, but sometimes directly against the documents of Vatican II themselves, against the Council itself, sometimes in the form of open calls to ignore Vatican II or to go back to the previous periods. This is a massively important development to understand the relations between the path of Catholic theology dealing with Vatican II and the engagement of the Church in world affairs, but also the way in which the Church deals with its past. Here, the key function that Nostra Aetate plays in the theological architecture of the Council is one of the most powerful arguments against the delegitimization of the event of Vatican II. The neo-traditionalists have, in recent years, sought to delegitimize also the very documents of the Second Vatican Council by saying that the real meaning is completely the opposite of what the Catholic tradition and all the popes have said about that in these last 60 years. The rejection of the idea of some necessary discontinuity in the recent tradition and magisterium as questioned, for example, the understanding of ecumenism and interreligious dialogue that has developed in the Church over the last 50, 60 years. Way beyond the boundaries of what is usually identified as schismatic Catholic traditionalism, some influential leaders in American Catholicism have allowed a dangerous minimization of the importance of the teaching of Vatican II. Their acceptance of Vatican II has become much more limited to some documents, usually the four constitutions, with a dangerous belittling of other documents, especially the declarations such as Nostra Aetate. And this has enormous consequences on the understanding in Catholic circles of the importance of Jewish-Christian dialogue for the Catholic Church. The battles for the meaning of Vatican II had spread from the level of hermeneutical reflection in abstract to the level of ecclesial concrete interpretations of council documents, for example, in liturgical matters. This is, as we all know, a very serious intra-ecclesial issue. But there is also an issue ad extra of relationship between the Church and the world. We cannot separate the ongoing ecclesial lapse in the memory of the importance of Vatican II and of Nostra Aetate from the current crisis of the relationship between Catholic theology and modern pluralistic democracies. In other words, Vatican II and its teaching on the relations between the Church and the world, Gaudium et Spes, and non-Christian religions, and specifically with the Jews in Nostra Aetate, are two fundamental pillars of the acceptance by the Catholic Church of modern religious pluralism within the context of a cultural, social, and political pluralism. Now, this acceptance is in doubt, once again, I would say. On the right-wing side of the Catholic spectrum, in the USA of today, mainstream media, Catholic media, social media, best-selling books, reaching Catholic opinion makers and media-savvy church leaders, it's visible that the landscape of the Catholic intellectual contribution is tilted more than before toward an anti-Vatican II mentality, anti-liberal fantasies of an absolutist direction that echoes French Catholicism in the 19th century, sympathies with 20th century European dictatorships friendly to the Catholic Church and disastrous for all the others who were not Catholic, of course. So this is political theological fantasies of the 19th century, 20th century, in 21st century clothing. It is well known, but maybe also forgotten by some Catholics, what kind of anti-Semitic views these pre-Vatican II theological political cultures had of Jews. This is one of the factors that we need to consider in the face of what has been called recently the temptation of an unjewing of Jesus. That special relationship of intimate otherness between Judaism and Christianity as a God-given legacy was rediscovered by Vatican II and remains one of the most important mandates for our generation for the relations between Judaism and Christianity. In our ecclesial and theological context, the case of Nostra Aetate is particularly delicate because the acceptance or rejection of the legitimacy of Vatican II has immediate consequences for the acceptance or rejection of a series of theological and magisterial statements made since Vatican II on the relations between the Catholic Church and the Jews. Second issue, the Catholic Church and the State of Israel. The issue of the land has become an important one in the theological debate on Nostra Aetate compared to the silence of the Council on this aspect, a consequence of the choice back then to emphasize the religious nature of the declaration in order to avoid very carefully an impression of a political stance of the Catholic Church at Vatican II and of the Holy See on the statehood of the then young Jewish state of Israel. Vatican II helped reconcile Catholicism and Judaism, but the relationship between the Vatican and the State of Israel remained complicated for 3 decades at least. During his trip to the Holy Land in Jordan and Israel in January 1964, Paul VI was very careful never to utter the word Israel, thus avoiding even the suggestion of a recognition that would come only 30 years later. The questions of who should control the Holy Land and whether to recognize the State of Israel were not addressed by Vatican II Nostra Aetate, whose drafting was closely scrutinized not only by bishops and theologians and the Vatican Secretariat of State, but also by diplomats and Arab, Jewish, American observers. Vatican II ended before the Six-Day War of 1967 and the subsequent occupation of Palestinian territories, which have changed permanently the geopolitical situation in the Middle East. From then on, Israel was in firm possession of the whole of the Holy Land west of the Jordan River, including all the Christian holy places. This led the Vatican to modify its position in a pragmatic way. In an address to cardinals in December 1967, Paul VI called for, quote, a special statute internationally guaranteed, end quote, for Jerusalem and the holy places, which was different than internationalization. Now, we cannot know what Vatican II would have said if the occupation of the Palestinian territories had taken place before the end or during the council. But we do know that Arab states and Arab Catholic bishops and patriarchs at the Vatican II were strongly opposed, to use a euphemism, to anything that sounded like a recognition of the State of Israel. In the post-council period, Rome has looked at the State of Israel with a complex perspective very different from that of the time of Vatican II. In less than 50 years, the Vatican moved from opposition to the Zionist movement to a de facto recognition of the State of Israel, to a de jure, legally formal recognition in 1993. What's the problem here? The problem is that the Catholic Church has yet to develop a theology of the Holy Land. But informal recognition of the State of Israel in the early post-Vatican II period eventually led to official recognition. John Paul II's approach to the State of Israel is a good example of the implementation of Vatican II beyond the letter of the documents. One of John Paul II's major contributions to Jewish Catholic dialogue was the 1993 fundamental agreement between the Holy See and the State of Israel, which established full diplomatic relations with an apostolic nunciature in Israel and an Israeli embassy to the Holy See. The post-Vatican II Church came to accept the reality that the Christian holy sites were inside the Jewish State of Israel. But this remained a fairly pragmatic development, and all that happened also in the context of the negotiations leading towards the Oslo Accords and before the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. The absence of a theology of the Holy Land expresses the situation in which the Catholic Church and the Vatican, which are not the same thing, stand with respect to the State of Israel. The reasons have more to do with the politicization of religion in global affairs today than with purely dogmatic concerns. The Church is alert to the ambiguities of civil religion in which Catholicism can be sucked in by different groups in the Catholic Church, outside of the Catholic Church. Again, the only way forward for a theological understanding of the statehood of the State of Israel is only through a continuation of the path opened by Vatican II. The Catholic Church may not have formulated a theology regarding the role of Israel as a Jewish state in God's plan, but it does have a vision of the nation state and of the relations between ethno-nationalism, secularism, and confessionalism. Generally speaking, the Vatican position at Vatican II and after is critical of ethno-nationalism, of majoritarianism, of confessionalism, of discrimination on the basis of race and of ethnicity. And this has been part of the tensions between the Vatican of Pope Francis and the governments led by Benjamin Netanyahu in the last few years. The issue of the land is relevant for the problem of the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church. Why is that? A rejection of the legitimacy of the teaching of Vatican II on the relations between the Church and the Jews leads to a delegitimization of the embodiments of modern Judaism, included at the level of statehood, as they express an emancipation from a preconciliar view of the Jews as subject to Christian supremacy. What John Pawlikowski called in a recent essay, quote, "The classical teachings of the Church Fathers who argued that Jews had lost any legitimate land claims because of their failure to accept Jesus as the expected Jewish Messiah," end quote. There's no possibility to accept the legitimacy of any state of Israel against or outside accepting the legitimacy of Nostra Aetate and of Vatican II, even though the Conciliar Declaration avoided carefully at that time any statement on that issue for reasons that are well known. Now, the rise of anti-liberal, illiberal, neo-traditionalist views in Catholic circles that are very active in public scholarship, public theology, especially in the United States, is alarming as it subtracts legitimacy to Vatican II in its entirety. And it would be naive to think that the issue of the state of Israel and of Judaism entirely would be spared by this wholesale rejection of the theological and magisterial turn taken by the Catholic Church with Nostra Aetate at the Council and in the decades afterwards. At the same time, the void left almost 60 years ago by Vatican II is gradually being filled by Christians and Catholics around the world who have different reasons for giving or taking away from the state of Israel their support. And this is just one example of the complicated nature of Catholic globalization in the age of nationalism and sectarianism. And this is my third point. Vatican II took place in the context of the post-World War II, Cold War international order. The foundational role of John the 23rd last encyclical Pacem in Terris on April the 11th, 1963, in opening this new chapter in Catholic theology and magisterium is beyond dispute. And on that chapter, the Council Fathers built a new chapter of the Catholic tradition. But the differences in terms of historical political context are particularly evident today when we look at the Catholic view expressed in the documents of Vatican II, of the nation state, of democracy, individual rights, especially in Gaudium Spes, but also in the most American of all documents of the Second Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, on religious liberty. In terms of a political philosophy and doctrine of the state, Vatican II acknowledged the contribution of modern constitutionalism for the development of an understanding of human rights that is compatible with the gospel. It was the end of the Catholic theology of monarchic legitimism, of government thanks to divine right. Vatican II talked in a positive way, even if indirectly, of the constitutions of the modern state, of the separation of powers, of elections, of mutual independence and collaboration between church and state, between religion and politics. In Gaudium et Spes, the Church acknowledged the history of its clash with nationalism and expressed the awareness that the Church had grown in that struggle. Vatican II also articulated a clear rejection of ethno-nationalism and of religious nationalism, and saw the danger of the nationalist identification of the Church with nation or race. But there's something even more momentous in the state of the reception of Vatican II today that concerns directly the issue of anti-Semitism. And it has to do with the global historical context in which the conciliar teaching on anti-Semitism and its reception in the first post-conciliar period took place. Vatican II was, for the Catholic Church, part of a larger cultural process of taking stock of the Shoah in the Western world, especially in Western Europe and in North America. But it is well known that there was a continuity in the personnel and in the culture of political elites between the 1930s and post-World War II Europe, both at the national level and in the new continental institutions building a new Europe. And this was true also in the Catholic Church, where many of the clergymen and lay Catholic intellectuals who had quietly witnessed and did not oppose the alliance between the Catholic Church and fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, Francoism in Spain, were still at the helm, both in their countries, in their political systems, and in the Vatican well after 1945. And so Vatican II represented a cautious, incomplete, and to some extent unconscious, instinctual reckoning with the past, but also an important moment of discontinuity in the self-understanding of the responsibilities of Catholicism for anti-Semitism and the Holocaust or Shoah. At the same time, that consciousness came mostly from the European and North American participants at Vatican II, not only the voting members, the Council Fathers, but also the theological experts, the ecumenical observers, the media, the public at large. This new consciousness that was key to bring about Nostra Aetate had to face the opposition against any doctrinal change that could be interpreted as the forging of a new close relationship between the Church and the Jews. That was the European opposition against Nostra Aetate, which had to do with a theological traditionalism and sometimes also sympathies for the pre-World War II authoritarian regimes, while for important Middle Eastern participants of Vatican II, the dominating factor was the precarious situation of Catholics in the Arab states in the context of the tensions in the international relations between the state of Israel and its neighbors. At Vatican II, the Catholic tradition deploring anti-Semitism was part of the process of leaving behind a chapter in the history of church-state relations in Europe that had contributed to World War II. At the same time, at Vatican II, the historical responsibilities of the Catholic Church in colonialism were not addressed or very indirectly. And this is true for the history of the presence and activities of Catholics in North Africa and the Middle East especially, but even more for what we now call the Global South. Today, in the 21st century, one of the most momentous changes in Catholicism is the rise in the consciousness of being a global Catholic Church. This means the search for a new Catholic form that is less or not dependent at all on a European Western cultural and theological matrix. But this means also a radical critique of all aspects of the Catholic tradition through the filter of a post-colonial or decolonial narrative. This is incredibly important because one of the consequences of this global turn is the relativization of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and of the historical specificity of the Holocaust, which is now looked more and more, is looked at more and more in the wider global context of the history of other genocides, other genocidal events, and world events. Here, global Catholicism now means a demographic shift to a post-colonial global world in states and cultures where the post-Holocaust legitimacy of the State of Israel has little or no relevance at all, but also the post-Holocaust legitimacy of the Catholic theology of the relations with the Jews has little relevance. Discussion on the philosophical uniqueness of the Holocaust aside, this could imply a devaluation of the theological and religious factors in the Christian tradition leading to anti-Semitism. Also because this post-colonial or decolonial turn often embraces a narrative that sees religion as a major source of civilizational conflicts and wars in history. It doesn't believe in interreligious dialogue for peace and coexistence. This post-colonial and decolonial turn presents the Catholic Church, the Catholic theological argument against anti-Semitism with a long-term and very serious challenge. There is the need to keep the awareness of the theological and religious factors in the history of anti-Semitism and of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism in the Christian tradition. This is a challenge that augments the already well-known rejections or dismissals of Nostra Aetate. One example of this global reinterpretation of the Holocaust under a global lens, in his case an ecological lens, is for example, Yale historian Timothy Snyder. The reinterpretation of the 20th century European history included the Holocaust with a global lens entails a critical assessment, and this is very important, of the self-righteous liberal narrative for the construction of the post-World War II order. This has very important consequences for the legitimacy of the Western liberal narrative of Vatican II, included for its teaching on anti-Semitism. In other words, the dismantling of the narrative of a supposedly benevolent and universalist nature of Western European and North American liberal order could wipe away, or at the very least could diminish, also the legitimacy of the teaching of Vatican II, which deplored anti-Semitism, but remained silent on the responsibility of the Western European and North American powers in the attempt to maintain their supremacy over the rest of the world, even after 1945. The post-colonial or decolonial narrative relativizes the Holocaust, but also tries to expose the cynicism of the fight against the totalitarian regimes in World War II and the defeat of the state-sponsored anti-Semitism as just another way to preserve the colonial systems of the winners of World War II. The issue here is that the denunciation of the blindness of the Western European narrative about the history of colonialism has far-reaching consequences for the perception of the teaching of Vatican II, and even more and directly on the relations between the Church and the Jews. The consequences of this shift coming from the turn of historiography and public intellectuals in the West towards the global, and of intellectuals in the global South towards the West, are not limited to the pages of some elitist magazines, but have a reach that goes way beyond those limited audiences. For example, The recent push in universities in the Western world for diversity, equity, and inclusion aimed at a legitimate and necessary diversification of the canon of texts read and studied, especially in required courses in the humanities, relativizes anything that has European roots in favor of cultural, literary, and religious traditions coming from other parts of the world. This means important changes also in the place that the teaching on the historical roots of anti-Semitism has in our shared cultural canon. On the one hand, the wider context of Western and European religious history in which to locate anti-Semitism could get lost very easily. On the other hand, religious history and theology is left more and more to special centers, special institutes, that are not always interested in teaching Vatican II and Nostra Aetate specifically. This could happen or is happening already in some Catholic schools, colleges, and universities that operate in a competitive marketplace of education. These developments, in terms of an expansion of the historical and literary canon, could be rife with problems because from the point of view of the Christian tradition and of the Catholic tradition since Vatican II especially, the relationship between the Church and the Jews is the paradigm of all diversity and commonality. Anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism are theological crimes in the sense of a perversion of that relationship. But also systemically, this is a very serious problem because this relativization and weakening of the historical consciousness of anti-Semitism has an impact not just at the intellectual level of intellectuals working in academia, but could also involve the new cohorts of the clerical elites, the future priests and religious, bishops, cardinals, papal diplomats, and Roman Curia officials. For the future of the Catholic Church, this shift in the cultural perception of anti-Semitism could be much more consequential than any institutional or structural reform. To conclude, especially after October the 7th, anti-Semitism has become part of the landscape of our conversations, but also of our cities, of our schools, of our social media, in new ways. If there's one important thing to do, is to learn and to teach how many different forms anti-Semitism can take and what is on the menu as the anti-Semitism du jour today. One simplistic way to look at the relations between Vatican II and the resurgence of anti-Semitism is to frame Vatican II as an episode of the naive illusion of the end of history, the end of theological anti-Semitism as part of a post-Cold War reverie, a naive declaration of a golden age without an end, and now we're waking up. I believe this is a wrong, simplistic way of looking at that. I think that the first step is to look at the relations between the Catholic Church and the Jews and Israel, beginning with Vatican II. Everything starts there, but with a long-term historical view that looks at the complex Vatican II history, various key dates, 1980, 93, 95, 2000, getting rid of a typical Catholic complex to look at things as we would like them to be and not as they are. Now, clearly, I believe October the 7th and these last few months are a periodizing event that has consequences difficult to predict for Israel, for the Jews worldwide, but also for the Catholic Church in very specific ways, and this is my very modest contribution to this job. Thank you very much. I don't know what happens now, but I'm very happy to take questions, to hear comments. I'm all for it.
Yes, we have plenty of time for Q&A. We do have the portable mic that Kathy is hooking up so I can carry it around so that we can all hear your question. But if anyone has a good projecting voice with a first question, that might be a way to get us started.
Please.
I was ordained in 1964, and I walked around in Rome during Vatican II. So I'm very pleased what you had to say about Vatican II. And well, I won't summarize it. But I read a book by Ratzinger. I'm still reading them. When he was a young teacher in Germany, and his classes were overthrowing the people. Well, a lot of people came to him to listen to him. But I just happened to find the book. I forgot the author of it. But Ratzinger he was an observer or a young man during his time of Vatican II. And what he perceived as theological issues
So there's no question that at Vatican II, Joseph Ratzinger was one of the major thinkers, together with Congar. There's no question about that. This is relevant for us because at Vatican II and in Nostra Aetate, the issue of the relations with the Jews was framed mostly in ecclesiological terms, meaning the church cannot understand itself without looking seriously at relations with the Jews. And Ratzinger's contribution was mostly for in the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican. So that was a major influence. Now, what's the problem here that I'm not blaming on Joseph Ratzinger is that in the post-Vatican II, we had a huge advancement, a huge construction on the foundations of Nostra Aetate with John Paul II. And the whole theological discourse by Joseph Ratzinger that he laid out in the famous speech of December 2005 of a reform in continuity made the whole church more cautious in advancing on all issues, included on the Jewish-Catholic dialogue. And we are still there, because Pope Francis is a pontificate of significant differences with Pope Benedict, but of a rebalancing on some issues, not of going forward. This pontificate is much more about rebalancing than moving forward, in my opinion. Right? And so that is where we are, I think. It was very interesting. Of course, in Joseph Ratzinger, there was a very important consciousness of speaking as a German, as a German Catholic, as a German Pope. That was very, very important. It was also very interesting to see that he decided, or someone for him, decided to publish one of his writings on Nostra Aetate after he had resigned. So there are so many interesting things. But Ratzinger is a major figure in the history of the Second Vatican Council and the post-Vatican II, but we are still now trying to figure out what it means for the Catholic Church and the Jews, what's next, because John Paul II could make huge leaps and could take with him the whole church. He had an authority that Benedict didn't have and Francis doesn't have for many different reasons. So we are in this situation here, I believe.
I have a mic here now, so anyone who has a question, I will come to you.
Thank you so much, Massimo. This is somewhat of a follow-up question. I'm wondering, because part of what was going through my head as you were giving this wonderful analysis is the place of the advancement of secularity in both sort of that I think it's an aspect of that post-colonial narrative that you're talking about. But I also wonder if it creates a kind of a funneling for more traditionalism in the places of power within both, all of the religious sectors.
This is very important because I believe that, I was born in 1970, so I'm old enough to see how much I've changed in my theological understanding of things. So I was born and I grew up in Europe, in a culture where the secular, or the secularization, the secularity, was assumed to be a liberation of religion from certain shackles, and so more gospel-like we can be. Now, we have seen that there is a parallel, so that more secular nations, more secular cultures, secular countries, they are those countries where religion becomes more fundamentalist. And so I believe we are now in the United States, in Israel, in Hungary, in some countries, we see that. So what is part of this process is understanding how many secularities there can be, because one can be Belgium, the Netherlands, where religion disappears almost, right? But it can be other countries where religion takes the form of an ethno-nationalist view. And so this is the new context with which Nostra Aetate has to deal with, because at the time of the Second Vatican Council, 1960s, I was born 5 years after Vatican II was ended. The idea was, at Vatican II, we have learned a lot from the experiences with fascism, Nazism, but World War II. Religion and politics will be able to interact in a collaborative way. I think we've seen something, and we are seeing something different in this country, in my own country, Italy, and so on. So that is very important because there are very few countries in the world now, in the new Europe, Eastern Europe, and where a new nationalist narrative is not associated with a religious narrative. Hungary, India, the Middle East, so that is an element of context, and that's why I believe that theology needs really to be a multidisciplinary study, because you need to look at the world as it is changing to locate this incredibly scripturally, theologically issue of the relations between the church and the Jews, but there's a whole picture of what it means to be a state now. Where is power today? Where is knowledge? At Vatican II, knowledge was in the universities. Now knowledge is almost everywhere but universities. I mean, it's in Silicon Valley, AI, YouTubers, whatever, right? So that has a huge impact on how people understand religion and the religious other. It's terrifying. Honestly, it is terrifying. So it's a very important question. Thank you, David.
Hello, thank you for that. You opened with October 7th, you closed with October 7th. It showed up along the way. But all of the trends that I could understand, and you wove in a lot, so it doesn't mean I didn't weave it wrong, of traditionalism in the Catholic world, especially in the Anglo and U.S. area world, more of a disdain for ethno-nationalism and the traditional religious-driven state, as well as the rejection of Vatican II, which impacts both Judaism in general as well as Israel as a Jewish place. So what I don't see is how or if October 7th really, how does that change anything? All of that was in play. How would this talk have been different on October 6th? Because it seems like everything in play was in play. And I don't see, is it just looking forward that you think something's going to change, or is something already different?
So yes, it would have been different in this sense that I personally have paid more attention to what led to where we are now, right? So I don't think we can, so the 90s are the lost decade in world politics, in Italian politics and so on. And so I think what happens on October the 7th, 2023 begins in November 95 when Rabin was assassinated. So that has given, I think, us more focus. I mean, when all this started, right? So I do believe that it has changed because there's a connection, for example, between a certain kind of theological culture, both within Catholicism and within other churches, that is very oriented towards a fundamentalist, and they are the same voices that often they advocate for a Catholic Zionism, which is something that the Vatican is very wisely paying a lot of indifference to, right? So, but they are those same voices, right? So I believe that, so events, especially in church history, in theological history, it's not just one day, right? So it's one day that tells you something about what had been happening in the last decade and so on. So I saw in these last few months, because I was in Rome in this conference at the Gregorian with the Cardinal Secretary of State in the same room with the Israeli ambassador to the Holy See that 2 hours before had issued an incendiary statement accusing the Catholic Church of not having learned anything from World War II and the Holocaust. I'll never forget that. So it's a genuinely dangerous situation because we don't know what's after getting rid of your enemy. Politically, ethnically, ideologically. We don't know what's next, right? So I think that this is a particular moment when wise people should speak, when wise people should also shut up, which is now the most difficult thing to do. But it has, so this is something that I started thinking about a couple of years ago, and I have no interest in seeing myself as a prophet or something, but if we look at who are now, for example, the strongest supporters of the government of Israel, in these days, we see exactly what role religion plays on the world map. They're not separate issues, it's the same one. So I'm not sure I replied to your question, but I said something that was important to me. It's, we thought with John Paul II that we had made the step, and that there was a promised land of a new relationship. Now that goalpost has been moved. Theologically, politically, this is a time to rebuild. People in my profession, I mean academics, have been told for decades that we had to be critical, we had to deconstruct, we had to tear down. Well, I see a lot of rubbles that need to be rebuilt. And it will take a generation at least. That's what I can say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faggioli. I was privileged to be in Rome during the years of the Second Vatican Council, and I recall very clearly the reports, daily reports, of the pressures from Arab countries on any Eastern Rite bishops who would dare to speak on this issue. And so I, on the one hand, I see the caution that is expressed in the documents of Vatican II. At the same time, I do recall very vividly the pressures against saying anything about that political moment in history and the developments of the nations. I wonder if you have any comments about that. Thank you.
It's absolutely true. That has been documented, has been studied. That is something that was not just a political animus of these Arab state Catholics against Israel, but it was the beginning of a new form of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism. There's no question about that. Now, I think that paradoxically, that was a fortunate voice to be there. Why is that? Because of what has happened in the Middle East in these last 30 years, after 1990, I would say, the presence of Christians and of Catholics in the Middle East, in the states that are neighbors of Israel, has become statistically insignificant, or very, very small. This has produced an identification of Christianity, and especially of Catholicism, with the West, which is theologically a disaster. It is truly a disaster because it magnifies the otherness, the Roman, Greek roots of Christianity and of Catholicism, and this idea that we are, so that there's an intimate relationship, that Jesus was Jewish, is something that is more difficult to see, actually, there's this idea that, as I mentioned, I mean, some commentators, they take for granted and they sell it in their columns in the most important newspapers in the world, that Catholicism is a Western thing, which is, it's laughable, but it's also tragic, right? So at Vatican II, we still had a church that was driven theologically by white male from Europe and North America, okay? But the presence of Middle Eastern and North African Catholics was more significant than today. And so this is one other problem that we have, how to rediscover the global dimension of the Catholic Church that we have lost just in the last few decades. And it's very hard to imagine how to reconstruct a Christian presence in Iraq, right? But this is something that has a lot to do with how we interpret Nostra Aetate, for example.
We have time for another question. Who?
I have another. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Didn't see you. No, go ahead. Oh, no, someone else.
Okay.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I'm trying not to oversimplify everything, but I think you were saying that the West is dead?
No.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that we didn't totally misunderstand that. However, the sense of the globalization of the church recognizes that the center has moved from Europe and North America to the global South, and particularly to Asia and to Africa. But you have in front of you a captive audience of seminarians from North America. And you have 5 minutes to tell them how to perhaps bridge the gap, as you have said, over a generation or so, because they're going to be pastors for the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. How do they deal with the reality of anti-Semitism, knowing that in the global church there is perhaps a different outlook upon the West and how we understand things and perhaps how they do as well? So you have 5 minutes with seminarians. Good luck.
Yes. So, I mean, I would say two things. One is to understand the importance of the magnitude of the shift that we have seen in these last few years, with Pope Francis being the first Latin American Pope of the 21st century of the third millennium. So my thesis is that Catholicism is behaving a little bit more like what geologists call the Pangea, right? Continents drifting away, right? But with Pope Francis, we have seen the degree of this magnetic drift of the continents taking an unprecedented speed. It has become much more visible, the difference between what bishops in Africa or Asia say on some things and on other things, right? So that is understanding the crucial moment. It's really the beginning of the third millennium, which will be different from the first millennium of the church and of the second millennium. Second is that one of the surest thing and safest thing is that we can say that John Paul II and Pope Benedict and Francis have different views on the specificities of the theology of interreligious dialogue and of Judaism. But there is an impressive, astonishing, and unusual coherence of Catholic teaching on the issue of the relations between the Jews and the church. There's this idea that we cannot be a church without looking at the relations with the Jews. That has been very consistent. Has been uncontroversial under all popes. And so there are many issues that are debated, are controversial. Not this one. So this has become debated again because of a forgetting, of a dismissal of ignorance, of willful ignorance, of interested ignorance in Vatican II, especially by some public intellectuals, commentators who are actually proud that they never studied theology. I don't think one should be proud of being ignorant of theology while pontificating about theology. But this is what's happening, right? So we should take pride in studying theology because this is something that has changed the world before. This issue has changed the relations between Christians and Jews, Catholics and Jews. The first time a pope walked into a synagogue was 1986. I mean, I was 15 years old. I mean, it has happened in my life. So this is something that there is an uncontroversial unanimity of church teaching on that. And whoever says, well, this is not important, this has been reviewed, this is just false. So there are different interpretations of the pillars of that teaching. But if there's one document that has been consistently, unanimously embraced and developed by all popes, is Nostra Aetate, much more than any other document, if we want to say that. So this is very important because now we are in this culture where the less you know, the more you feel free to speak. Especially in religion, in God, because this is a form of fundamentalism that I have the phone number of God and I can know everything directly from God. This is very dangerous. It is incompatible with a Catholic understanding of the tradition, of the teaching. So I don't know how much time I took, if it was 5 minutes or 3 or 6. But this is, Nostra Aetate is really like the thermometer of what has happened in the Catholic Church in these last 60 years. We are still debating what to do in terms of inclusion of LGBT Catholics and so on. We are not debating whether the church has an institutional mission of conversions of the Jews. We are not debating that. We have decided, all popes have decided that we do not have, as a church, an institutional mission of converting the Jews. That has been repeated by all of them. It's just one example, right? So we are on safe ground there. And it's not the end of the path, but it has been, so there are some voices out there that are an aberration, that have very, very personal agendas, I think. There is a mainstream that goes well beyond the usual liberal conservative rift, which doesn't exist when we talk about this issue. That it's a very important element, this, right? So we're polarized, right? But we're not polarized on that unless you are willing to call yourself outside of what all popes in the last 60 years have said. If you want to do that, but that's where you are putting yourself. And this is something that I think we should be ready to tell our students, our people we know, because this is a matter of great, great importance, I think.
Is it possible that there's one question from this side of the house? Wonderful.
Grazie per essere qui oggi con noi, Dr. Faggioli. Thank you for being with us today. It's an honor. I just want to say that many of the things you've spoken about to us, we are spectators of. We can not aspire to do more than to watch as the world unfolds. But as history has taught us, for evil to succeed, all it requires is for good people to do nothing. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe this room is full of good people. So what would you say to us with our feet on the ground that are not at the level of pope or bishop or cardinal or leader of synagogues or congregations, at least not yet? What would you say to us in this room here that we can do to honor, respect, even love one another in the name of God and for the sake of peace, the sake of shalom in the world and between our communities?
Well, thank you for your welcome in Italian, first of all. So I would say this, that also when it comes to anti-Semitism and the relations between the church and the Jews, love needs work. It's not easy. It's not natural. It needs work. And so there is a theological, intellectual work that needs to be done, that has been done. We now witness a certain wave of anti-intellectualism, which is in some cases naive, in other cases is very intentional in saying you should let us make some decisions and you will. So it's important to talk about these things, to study these things, and to be witness. Right, so I haven't seen, I don't know if there are other voices that are taken seriously, like the ones of serious religious authorities, right? Because I mean, being heard and being listened to are two different things, and so that. To be very blunt, in America, in the United States, religion still has an enormous power to change people's minds, to convert ourselves. I mean, America has converted me in some sense. I mean, it has opened my eyes, my European eyes, naive on some issues, right? So there's a lot that can be done, that must be done, especially in the next few months and in the next few years. There's plenty of work. There's no shortage of things to say and to do. And you are much more on the front lines than I am, because I'm an academic. I miss these kind of things, of opportunities, because academia now has become much more under control. There are some issues that maybe are not really relevant for the universities, while this issue is very relevant for you and for the people that you minister to, you talk to. So I think this is really a job for the future. I mean, we don't know what will, with AI and all of that, what kind of jobs we'll have in the future. I'm pretty convinced that the job of talking to people's hearts will always be there. So, that's it.
One last question. Did I see your hand?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for your presentation. So you are at Villanova.
Yes.
In Milwaukee, the major Catholic Jesuit university is Marquette. It has very few Jewish students, has a rather significant number of Arab Islamic students. It has some Jewish faculty, some Islamic faculty. And there's been a pretty robust debate on campus since October 7 as to what is anti-Semitism, what is anti-Zionism. A lot of effort, including by some of the Jewish professors, to critique Zionism and distinguish it from anti-Semitism, and presenting a narrative of Israel being seen in the light of a settler state, a European project imposing on the people of Palestine the sins of anti-Semitism in Europe. And I'm interested in knowing what, if anything, you've observed or perceived in terms of the debate within the academic community, either at Villanova or in broader terms on this debate. Thank you.
That's a very important question, because this is really important for what we're doing here and for what we were talking here before. My humble observation is this, that Catholic colleges and universities have been able to talk about this in ways that are significantly better from other universities. And not because we're more holy or anything like that, but because the Catholic colleges and universities right now, they have been shaped in many different ways by the Second Vatican Council, by these last 60 years. So we have acquired an habit of doing diversity well before it became a buzzword. Right? It starts in the 70s and so on. So this is a very good argument in favor of Catholic higher education, Catholic culture, because we have all the faults in the world, maybe, but we have been able, from what I've seen, to treat that issue with a fundamental respect for all individuals who were involved in that. There has been a self-restraint against categorizing the others in labels, right? So I believe that has been a test for some of our schools where we haven't seen the same kind of incident we have seen in other Ivy League universities, for example. That's very important because, and this doesn't happen naturally. It doesn't happen magically. So there is a certain ethos of dialogue and of conversation that has been hard won. And we discover how valuable that is in moments like this, right? So every local Catholic college is different. But what I've seen is an environment that is aware of how delicate this issue is. Most importantly, it has, I believe, in my eyes, relativized the usual rift, liberal conservatives in the Catholic Church, the left, right, and so on, which has a great importance on this, but it is transversal, this issue, right? So this, I'm not to end on a positive note by contract, but I really believe that. This is something I've seen really bad episodes of bordering with anti-Semitism in public universities in Italy, which have become totally secular. And secular means not just non-Catholic, non-religious, but means also that you have a certain understanding of what kind of room we have here for what kind of voices, right? So I would say I don't know anything about Marquette dealing with this lately, but what I've seen at Villanova and in other colleges in the area, in the Philadelphia area, And there are some great examples in Catholic culture, Catholic education, of how to do serious dialogue between Catholic and Jews that is slow, is humble, is quiet, but is fruitful. That is it's work that pays in moments like this. And I believe we have seen something like that, I think.
Well, let me just conclude by saying what a rich conversation that was, and a wonderful presentation, Massimo. And any of you who do not have a connection to the Lux Center and wish you had a more enduring one beyond today, remember who raised their hands and who stood up earlier, and say something to them afterwards, or else grab my arm, or the co-director of the Lux Center is Rabbi Michal Wall right in the middle there. And let's thank Massimo.